I just spent maybe 15 minutes trying to figure out this whole recording setup, and it's not going to be perfect. So I'm going to stop trying to make it perfect. And I'm just going to clean the slate and just start with this imperfect video. And I figured I'd just introduce myself. So I have my little mic right in my lap, but my name is Erica. You might be following me already because you saw my video on Special Books by Special Kids and you heard about OCD and Pure O. So just to give a little bit of context, I am diagnosed with OCD, and that stands for obsessive compulsive disorder. Mainly, I experience internal compulsions, which just mean that I have certain mental or internal patterns or rituals, I'd say, that are performed in order to relieve anxieties due to my obsessions. So, for example, someone who is obsessing over an intrusive thought might try to undo that thought in their head in order to provide some relief for them. Right now, my most current themes of OCD have been relationship OCD and sexual orientation OCD. However, they are not so much of an issue right now because I have been in therapy specifically for OCD and anxiety for the past year or so. And I've learned a lot of techniques. I've learned mindfulness and just how to observe my thoughts. I am still struggling sometimes, but it's really a lot better than I was where I was about a year ago. But yeah, I thought today I would just give a little intro to this channel. To start with, I wanted to just talk about from the very beginning, when I was born. So I was born into a Chinese family. So I was actually Canadian. I was born in Canada, in Montreal, and I now live in the US. So I am part of an immigrant family. My parents are immigrants from China, and I was raised by my parents and my grandparents for a large portion of my childhood. I feel like I've told people in the past that I was born with a cloud over my head, which really what that means is just I feel like I was born crying. I mean, everyone was, but I feel like I cried so much when I was a kid. Every single day I'd cry about something, and I felt like it always kind of boiled down to people thinking that I was just entitled, that I was spoiled, and mainly that I was oversensitive and over emotional, that I was overreacting. And the way that affected me growing up is that I would cry more because I wanted people to take me seriously. For some people who are called over emotional in their childhoods, they tend to suppress and internalize those emotions so that it starts to kind of overflow over time because it's so suppressed and internalized. For me, it overflowed externally in the sense that no one listened to me when I cried even louder. No one listened to me when I was sad, then I yelled. I wanted them to take me seriously. I threw tantrums. I remember pretty vividly when I was 4 or 5, thinking about how I realized I had not remembered a day where I had not cried about something. And I thought to myself, I really need to just learn how to not cry. I'm not going to cry tomorrow. Tomorrow is a new day and I'm not going to cry tomorrow. And that next day, I remember that I was so close to crying. I could feel my eyes getting warm and the tears starting to come out. And I just thought to myself, like, this is not going to happen. I'm not going to do it today. And I did not. And that was my first success at trying to self-regulate my emotions, not crying, I suppose. But in my home, in my family's culture, crying was more attention-seeking than it was help-seeking, I guess. Crying was, you're not appreciating what we're doing enough for you. Crying was being entitled. And, I love my parents. I love my family. I appreciate a lot of Chinese culture. But as a Chinese American, Chinese Canadian, it was really hard to express my emotions without feeling like I wasn't going to be soothed. I felt like The only time I was soothed when I was crying was when I experienced physical pain. For example, if I ran too fast and I fell down and I scratched my knee, then people would take my physical pain seriously. But if I cried because I felt like someone had talked to me in a harsh way, or I cried because I felt like someone said something mean to me, or if I cried because I felt like something was unfair or unjust, none of that was taken seriously. So, in a way, I can see why, there are certain things that children do to get attention, but when every single time that I expressed emotional pain, it just was not really taken as seriously. So, that being said, I feel like it has caused me to become a very expressive and emotional person, which I don't mind. I think I'm really bad at lying because of that. My face always shows exactly what I'm thinking, even when I really try not to. I have a pretty good poker face sometimes in certain situations, but a lot of the time I end up showing exactly what I'm thinking on my face. So fast forward to me being a preteen. I was in a fairly strict household. A lot of Asian Americans can probably relate. However, my parents did allow me to go out with my friends. They did care about my grades, and they cared about my other accomplishments as well. But in some ways, they were actually pretty lax about me staying over with friends and hanging out with them. When I was 12, I experienced my first stint with OCD. It doesn't sound like OCD when you first start to hear me talk about it. I've told this story a few times before. Sometimes it might be hard to understand what this story really is about if you don't have OCD or you haven't really had obsessive cycles in your head before. But essentially what happened was I was 12 years old and I was watching Wedding Crashers on my dad's computer. And I was not supposed to be watching Wedding Crashers because, one, I had definitely pirated it, so it was free, but it wasn't supposed to be free. Two, I was watching it on my dad's computer, which I was not supposed to be. And then three, I was not supposed to be watching something that was R-rated. And Wedding Crashers is R-rated, I think. So, and I was 12 at the time, so definitely not something that I was supposed to be watching. Now, there was this one scene where the Wedding Crashers kept throwing women onto beds, not like throwing in a like abusive way, but you know what I mean? They're trying to sleep with them. With every scene, more and more clothing was removed, and I remember being really shocked. I don't remember exactly what I did. I think I either fast forwarded it or I just closed the laptop and stopped watching the movie that day. But regardless, after that movie, the rest of the day was normal. Then I went to sleep, and I remember literally having that sensation of trying to fall asleep. When you feel like you're actually falling, I felt like I was falling, and all of a sudden an intrusive thought popped into my head, and it was that scene of them throwing the women onto the beds. And I remember being so shocked. I just didn't know what it meant about me. I was like, oh my God, I've never had any kind of thought about this before in my life. What does this mean? Does this mean I'm gay? Did I like that scene? I don't think I did. So why did I have that scene in my head, pop into my head? And I remember sitting there in the bathtub, in the bathroom, wondering, questioning my entire life up to that point. And I guess it all sounds kind of comical, but I was really distressed about it. I was up for another 3 hours, I think. At some point, my mom realized that I was up. She came into the bathroom and she was like, "What are you doing?" And I just looked at her and I was like, "I'm just having a lot of thoughts in my head. I don't really know what's going on." And I said to her, "What would you do if I was gay?" And she said, "You gay?" And I was like, "I don't know." And she's like, "It's just a phase," which didn't really help, because I didn't necessarily have anything against being gay. I had known people who were probably gay at that point in middle school. But it was just more like, oh, if I was, my mom would be supportive of me. And now that's even further kind of stigmatizing that thought in my head. So regardless of if I was or wasn't, that conversation did not help. And I ended up, for that entire summer, because this happened at the beginning of the summer, every single show I watched, I would see someone on the screen and I'd be like, do I think that that person's attractive? What does that mean if I think they're attractive? Do I want to kiss that person? And then I would imagine doing that, kissing that person in my head, then wondering if I liked it or not. And then if and when in my head I felt, or if and when I felt disgust by imagining myself kissing them, I would think to myself, oh, well, maybe you're just in denial. Maybe you're just in denial because you're homophobic and you don't want to be gay, but maybe this is who you truly are. And so I even would sometimes just sit there by myself in my room and just try to say, okay, like definitively, I'm going to say I'm gay out loud and see how it feels. So I'd sit there and just be like, I'm gay. And that was supposed to be like my final resolution. And I'd be like, wait, that doesn't feel right. So maybe I'm not gay. So then I would that relieved the anxiety of me not knowing what I was anymore temporarily, because the next day I'd ask myself, well, maybe I just didn't say it right that time. So then I would say I'm gay or I'm straight. I'd alternate between the two to try to say these things out loud and see how I felt about them. And if you are not familiar with OCD, you're probably thinking, this just sounds like you're questioning your sexuality. I mean, yeah, I was questioning my sexuality, but it was not as a result of me being attracted to people, being attracted to girls at the time, and then thinking, oh, could I be gay? It was as a result of an intrusive thought. So the inception point was a little bit different. It wasn't that I had already felt an attraction. It was that I had an intrusive thought popped into my head. And then as a result of the intrusive thought that I did not enjoy or that I did not want in my head, that's where all the questioning came from. So I think it's really important to recognize what the inception point of an obsession is, because I think that's gonna really frame how it takes form later on. I also tried to replace certain thoughts in my head that I felt like I did not want to be there with thoughts that I felt should have been there more. So basically, the list of mental compulsions that I was performing was mental review, checking, in this case it was checking attraction, rumination, just kind of general questions about what do things mean. Does me thinking that this person's pretty mean that I think that they could be my girlfriend, etc. And then also just in general, what is my identity? Because the core of it was not that I feared being gay. The core of it was I feared that my entire identity up to that point was a lie. Was that my entire life had been a lie up to that point, and that I had misjudged every action that I had taken up until that point. And so it's kind of scary. You start to just really distrust yourself and question everything you've ever been through, everything you've ever done, every person you've ever interacted with. And it's kind of a scary experience. It starts to feel like your reality is something that you made up and that it's not what you're living in anymore. All I ever thought about at that point was like, when is this going to be over? I just want school to start again because this is like taking over my mind and I'm just so obsessed with this and I have no idea what's going on. I still think boys are cute. I don't understand. And, at the time, I really also didn't recognize bi, queer, all this stuff. We didn't really have, when I was 12, we didn't really talk about anything beyond straight or gay. Honestly, those definitions would not have helped me at the time, I think, either. After the school year started, I stopped having those obsessions because I was distracted. And that was a good thing. So I stopped obsessing about it. I honestly didn't even think about it for another few years. So in high school, I didn't really ever notice any other kind of pivotal OCD moments other than maybe just in general, I obsessed over my relationships and my friendships. And it really wasn't until college that I started experiencing OCD symptoms again. And that came as a result of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I believe, in college. I think it was in May. And I think it was called Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And essentially what happened was I, after reading all of the informational flyers and watching videos and reading articles about what sexual assault was, what consent was, I realized that I had been raped when I was 17, and that no matter what the circumstances were, I was not able to give consent. And it was honestly kind of traumatizing to realize that like something I had brushed off as a drunken hookup was actually considered sexual assault. And I'm not going to use rape as the word too much because it honestly causes me a little bit of anxiety to use that word. I'm even like doubting myself as I'm saying it, but it's pretty traumatic. I mean, I was pretty much unconscious, and that's what happened. And so I was honestly kind of re-traumatized. I think I started to remember more details about that night, and I started to realize that something had been done to me that I did not consent to. And so around that time, I just feel like I had that kind of awareness of sexual assault in the forefront of my brain. And I believe that this kind of re-triggering of that event started to trigger some more OCD thoughts, some intrusive thoughts. I started to have intrusive thoughts about harming myself. And when I say intrusive thoughts about harming myself, it was not that I desired for myself to be harmed. I did not desire to harm myself. It was more that every time I saw a sharp object, it was instantaneous. I didn't want to imagine it happening, but as soon as I would see a sharp object, immediately what would pop into my head was this thing hurting me. So for example, if I saw a pair of scissors, I immediately imagined it hurting me. And I would have these intrusive thoughts all the time. Everywhere I went, when I saw something sharp, I would just it would just instantaneously, the intrusive thought would come into my head about it harming me. And I remember being so annoyed and so shocked and kind of just like, I hate these thoughts. I just don't understand what's happening. Like, I don't want to do that. I started to feel anxious around sharp things. Whenever, sometimes people like they talk while they're cooking or they're cutting things and they're just kind of like waving the knife around while they talk. That really stressed me out because my mind was pretty much flooded with intrusive thoughts. And when your mind is flooded with intrusive thoughts and you don't know how to handle it, because at the time I did not really know what OCD was, you start to do anything you can to relieve anxiety. So I would try to imagine myself with a pillow or something, or I would try to imagine that knife being like, I don't know, just like a spatula instead or something like that. And sometimes I would even kind of brace my body for the imaginary impact of me having this intrusive thought. And honestly, sometimes I swear, like I would have these intrusive thoughts of these objects, and I would feel physical pain, as though it had actually hurt me. And I was pretty stressed, pretty annoyed, pretty stressed, pretty upset. Later that summer, I read an article about a horrible person sexually assaulting their child, and that unfortunately led to a whole another slew of intrusive thoughts. And the trigger was every time I saw a child, I imagined horrible things happening to them as a result of reading that one article. It felt like I had PTSD from reading an article. It was like every time and it was horrible because I had never had these kind of thoughts before, and I was extremely, extremely upset about it. And yeah, it's basically like someone keeps turning on a horror movie in your head and you don't want it to keep happening. And it's like, why is this happening? When you don't really know this is OCD and all you want to think about is getting rid of these thoughts, you replace these scenarios in your head with more positive scenarios, or you try to ruminate about like what did these thoughts mean, even though you logically, I knew that this was, if I could kind of logically, I could kind of pinpoint that all of these thoughts started happening when I was re-triggered by a traumatic experience, that thoughts about aggression and sexual assault had been in the forefront of my mind because that is what I had experienced. But for some reason, like, that didn't click in my head. All I could think about was the content of my thoughts and what it meant about me. And I kind of ignored that I had been through something traumatic. And not to say that all OCD or that even most OCD is caused by trauma, but sometimes that can cause the onset of OCD cycles. So I think for me, those two things kind of went hand in hand. I think my mind was trying to protect me potentially. I think my mind was trying to give me warning signs as to, what potential dangers were out there. And so just those two topics were at the forefront of my brain. And really it kind of went on and off throughout college for the next 3 years or so. Eventually I went to see a therapist, and the first two therapists I saw were just not good experiences. In the last year of college, I ended up being more involved in the social justice, social activism world. I joined the Asian American Student Union, and I led a leadership program on Asian American politics and Asian American leadership. And I started to learn about the history of violence against Asian Americans in U.S. history, and I ended up just seeing so many wrongs in the world. And I feel like although that experience that year was really helpful for me and opened my eyes to seeing how much institutionalized racism and a lot of myths like the model minority myth prevail in this society, I also feel like it ingrained an extremely high moral standard in myself, which I think has contributed to another theme of OCD that I have experienced and is ongoing at times, is moral scrupulosity. For anyone who doesn't know, moral scrupulosity is essentially a theme of OCD in which a person fixates over moral obsessions, such as if they're a good person, if they're a bad person, whether or not their actions are moral or immoral. And so I think that being in a very morally rigid community was both good and detrimental to me at times. Not necessarily because I think that format of social activism is damaging in and of itself, but it's more so because I already had obsessive tendencies at the time, and so I had to fixate over what things were moral and what weren't. And I was constantly on edge, whether or not I said the right thing, whether or not my partner at the time was saying the right thing, and just anything to do with that, I was extremely just very fixated about. Fast forward to now, I am in a different relationship than the one I was in college. I am in probably the best relationship I've ever been in, with my boyfriend Evan, and he has been just really, really instrumental, honestly, in me. Like, this is so, I'm like tearing up. He's been really instrumental in me kind of, this is so cheesy, but like believing in love again, because I feel like the fact that I met him, and I feel like I met him at a time where I met him only a few months after my last relationship ended, which was a relationship of 5.5 years in which I was not diagnosed with OCD yet, and so I would constantly berate my partner about my moral obsessions, and I would hold him to the same high moral standards as me, which was detrimental to our relationship and honestly, there was a lot of toxicity on both of our ends, a lot of emotional immaturity on both of our parts. And it was not a very healthy relationship. I don't think either of us really felt respected at times. And honestly, yeah, it's so we are the container of our relationship was not a very healthy one, not very conducive to growth. Sorry. So I ended up meeting Evan about a few months after my breakup from my previous relationship, and I really did not expect to like him so quickly. He was one of those people who the very first time I talked to him, I just got good vibes. I was excited. I was like, I haven't felt this excited about someone in years. I can't believe, that I can just click with someone like that. And the fact that he kind of renewed that excitement I had for relationships and I guess dating in general just made me realize that I had been missing out on something for a while. And yeah, our relationship has just always been pretty respectful. I mean, there are times that we both like slip up, but we don't call each other names. We really try to come together when it comes to figuring out arguments. Hey, Cece. And so that's why it was so devastating to me when I started to fixate over my sexual orientation again, because we had already been about 8 or 9 months into our relationship, and I had already just like known in my core that like this is the healthiest, most fulfilling relationship I've been in. And the fact that I am being tormented right now by these obsessions that, again, they kind of came out of nowhere. Like they just came, the inception point was an intrusive thought again. And normally I used to be able to brush it off, but for some reason it didn't. It just stuck. And I was so upset because I was like, oh my God, like I feel like my brain or whatever is trying to protect me from getting hurt again. So now I must kind of figure out every single potential fear or downfall of this relationship. Because at the end of the day, what OCD is trying to do is protect you. It's trying to find all the potential dangers and threats that you can encounter in the world, and usually in the theme that you're experiencing. And in this case, my relationship mattered a lot to me, and I feel like because I had previously gotten out of a pretty unhealthy relationship, I was trying to find fault with everything, and this was one of those things that I felt like could potentially become a threat. Now, logically, I know that you can be bisexual, that you can be queer, you can even identify as gay and still be in a heterosexual relationship, and I know all these things logically, but OCD does not really care about logic. OCD is driven by doubt, by fear, by anxieties, and by the uncertain. And so every time I logically responded to a question in my head, the next what if question would pop up. And it drove me crazy. And I was like, I'm not gonna let this ruin my relationships. This is insane. Like this is just awful. So I ended up going to a therapist, and she was able to diagnose me with OCD, which I had basically already known this entire time. But it was a relief that someone validated me. Past therapists tried to give me logical ways to get out of the thoughts in my head, which was not really helpful. But essentially, I've been in therapy for about a year now. Me and my therapist alternate between just talking about day-to-day stuff that I struggle with, as well with sometimes we just do ERP in our sessions. And ERP stands for Exposure and Response Prevention Therapy. It's considered the gold standard for OCD, and it has been useful in my journey. So the reason why I wanted to start this channel, and the reason why I wanted to kind of put myself out there as more of a mental health advocate, is because I actually went to the IOCDF conference back in July, which is the International OCD Foundation Conference. And that was where I learned a lot of the terminology, the clinical terminology that you use when describing OCD and recovery techniques. I also learned about ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, another form of therapy that is good for OCD. And in general, I just feel like mental health has always been something I've struggled with throughout my life, and that I'm really trying to make more of a commitment to stabilizing in this kind of next chapter of my life, I guess. And so I'd really like to just stick around on this channel. I might have some people on. I might post some podcast interviews. Maybe I'll just do some solo episodes like this. Let me know what kind of topics you'd like me to talk about. And really, as well, I just feel like there's a lack of Asian representation in the OCD community and in mental health circles as well. So I'd really like to kind of step out more and talk about mental health, because honestly, in Asian American cultures and communities, it's really hard to talk about mental health. It's not even recognized as an issue a lot of the time. And I just want to put my voice out there and hopefully help some people not feel so alone. So I think that's it. Thank you for listening to me ramble for however many minutes. I really appreciate you being here. Leave a comment if you have a topic to suggest I talk about for next time, or something you want to see. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks all.